Welcome to the Port City Plate Podcast, presented by Bienville Bites Food Tour. The Port City Plate Podcast, serving up the food, history, and people of Mobile, Alabama, for people who love the Port City. I'm your host, Chris Andrews, and I'm super excited about today's episode. Our guest today is none other than Cart Blackwell, and Cart is the extraordinary mind behind the curation at the Carnival Museum, Mobile Carnival Museum in downtown Mobile. And prior to him being the curator there at the Carnival Museum, Cart made a great reputation for himself as an architectural historian at the city of Mobile, and he's armed with degrees of art history, historic preservation, architectural history. So he brings a really unique and I think a great perspective to the show today. And anytime we can combine food and history, I'm all about it. I think though, really, I think Cart, what really sets him apart is his compelling storytelling ability. And ways that he's able to weave our city's past and really bring that history to life with, using entertainment and really enlightening tales. So I know some of you might recall the recent exhibit at the Carnival Museum that was called From Chicken on a Stick to Fancy Fare, Carnival and Cuisine. And this exhibit really explored the food history of Mobile and especially as it relates to our Mardi Gras celebrations. And so I'm really looking forward to this episode today. And so, Cart, thank you for coming on the Port City Plate Podcast.
Chris, it's always a pleasure to interact with you in any program you do.
Well, thank you. I first wanted to start and just get a little background on yourself. I know you're not a native Mobilian.
No.
And I think that's really what fascinates me the most about you is that you're not from Mobile, but you know more about Mobile than I would say 99.9%.
I don't know if I'd go that far, but I was not born in Mobile. I wasn't conceived under a Mobile azalea bush, maybe a Selma camellia bush. I grew up in Dallas County in Selma, and we got a place in Wilcox County, a little town called Possum Bend, and the Alabama River flows through both of those great areas, and it ultimately ends up via the Mobile River in the port city. So I guess I was destined to end up here, but the real reason I got here was I was contemplating a third master's degree, and my father promptly told me the gravy train had ended and I needed to get a job. And the first job interview was with the city of Mobile, and I took that job, and I served the city for 9 years.
Very good. That's good. And I think anybody from Possum Bend, Alabama, has got to be a good person, right?
Possum without an O at the beginning of it.
Even better. Did you grow up? Were you interested in history growing up? What age did you kind of realize that was kind of your thing?
I've always been interested in the past, and I credit my family. My dad, in particular, loved the past and genealogy, and just having a family place that I'll be the seventh generation owner. I think that was impactful. And Dallas and Wilcox counties have a lot of history, and my interest kind of zoomed in on buildings and art, and the art of food is among them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you studied at College of Charleston?
College of Charleston is where I got my undergrad, and it was a great just city. Put your feet down and become a young man. I mean, it's so walkable, and for someone who's an architectural historian, it's great. It's like a history book opened up around you. You live, work, and play in it, and then took a gap year, traveled, and then got my master's degree at the University of Virginia, which, I mean, to toot my own horn in a way, it has a beyond comparable program in architectural history. Just great instructors and a fabulous library, visiting professors, visiting lecturers. It was amazing, and just grateful for the experience of having it.
And those are two of the most historic cities
they're
in the United States.
I mean, to go from the low country to the Piedmont, I mean, it was a duck in water. It was great.
How did you end up at the Carnival Museum? So a curator at the Carnival Museum.
I was in the city for 9 years, and it was a true honor, particularly serving Mayor Simpson, but I was not cut out for just civil service. You can work and you get nowhere with it. I made a lot of good connections and had some good learning experiences and enjoyed serving the city. But the reason why I went into historic preservation is the past history. I like talking about and celebrating the past, particularly through research and writing, and the Carnival Museum afforded that opportunity. I'm still grateful for the Carnival Association contacted me and being their first professional curator, and it's been a wonderful experience. And I think another way which I can give back to a city that's been good to me. And Carnival is the common denominator from Mobile's rich past. I mean, there's no city like ours. We've had more colonial flags fly above us than any other, and rich periods of American history, and the Native American before that. I think there's so many things that you can celebrate, and Mardi Gras kind of touches all of them. So it's a niche bill. There's only one museum dedicated to Carnival in the world, and it's fun to serve that institution.
Yeah, that's awesome. And like I mentioned in the introduction, you had an exhibit. It was last year. You had the exhibit from chickens on a stick to fancy fare, Carnival and cuisine. And I was really, like I said, fascinated by that exhibit, and I got so much out of it that I really wanted, like I said, kind of wanted to go through some of that with you today, and
that
chronologically, so what was Mobile's, going back before our founding of the French, before 1702, what were the people in this area, what were some of their foodways like?
Mobile's indigenous populations, the Native Americans, and there are multiple epochs of them, and you have to take it to the very end of, like, DeSoto came in, and there were so many diseases unleashed that it created virtual new tribes, if you will, and those that were around the Mobile area built upon that which preceded them. And they, like now, they had access to some of the best foodstuffs imaginable, stuff from the Gulf, the fish there, the river delta, our river systems. I mean, you had wonderful oysters. I mean, when you think of the mounds in the Mobile River Delta, our Amazon, they were often faced with oyster shells, the oyster middens where they would put the leftovers, fish, I mean, corn, I mean, deer, duck. I mean, it's phenomenal what they had, and they drew from water, multiple type of water, the Gulf, the various aspects of the Delta, the creek system, the river, and the rich soils of Mobile and Baldwin County, which is amazing because we still grow such amazing produce, and that corn can be traced right back to those Native Americans.
Yeah, it is really interesting and fascinating when you think about it.
They provide a wonderful foundation which all epochs have drawn upon since. It's kind of like a gumbo. They're the roux.
Right. That's a good way to put it. Now, the French arrived 1702. Now, they didn't, it started off a little rocky for them, right?
I mean, you gotta think. I mean, Alabama is, in its various periods of settlement, was always adaptation for those people coming in. I mean, they had to adapt how they built, how they ate, how they dressed, how they accommodated, in particular what was then very much a frontier climate. I mean, the French cuisine is very, very different then and now from what you encounter here. And the staple of French food was bread, and you didn't have the grains and things to do that. They didn't have the ability to do bread for say a Eucharist or just your average meal. I mean, and there was great disgust in having to eat this cornbread. And so they had to adapt, and in some ways it was probably delightful. I mean, again, with the bountiful game and things to access, but they had to put a footing in town and to adapt their culinary practices to what they found and shape it. And that's something that's true for all of the ensuing colonial period. They each put the stamp on there of dealing with nature's bounty, be it from the water or from the soil, and giving their own take on it. But that they had the hardest row of it, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, I want to get your opinion on what do you think life was like here in Mobile, at the old Mobile site, 27 Mile Bluff, before the town moved here in 1711. What was that old town like?
Probably miserable.
Yeah.
This was not a trip into the hunting camp or fishing camp in the Mobile River Delta. It was no air conditioning, very few women, and not much booze. And so this was not a good situation, just abysmal, hot and humid. And they moved it down here for reason of the soil. There was no means of expansion. If you go up 27 Mile Bluff now, it's high. I mean, that's more than what you think. You're literally climbing up on that bluff, but it drops off. So it was swampy, mosquito-ridden. I mean, mosquitoes the size of hummingbirds. So they moved it down here, and thus the city has grown and the metropolitan area around it since. So it would have been rough up there, and they left for a good reason.
What about trade with the natives during that time?
The trade with the natives is something that informed all of the ensuing colonial epochs. And it could get a little touchy at times. I mean, because the French, the British, and Spanish were coming in and taking food, women and land, and no one's going to put up with that. So it was a very testy situation. That said, the French had a better relationship with the various Native American tribes than the British and the Spanish that followed them. But I mean, it was touchy. I mean, it was like the Pilgrim story in a way, if you will. It was the Native Americans that made it possible for the French to put a little foothold, but things were dicey at times, if you will.
Mm-hmm. I'm most fascinated by the man Francois LeMay, and he was a member here at the old colony, Mobile's early days, and ended up moving to New Orleans. Really, all we know about him is that he was a baker, but moved to New Orleans and started a place called the Bellegarde Bakery, which is the oldest bakery in New Orleans. And it goes without saying, how influential that profession has been to New Orleans and their food scene. But he was in here at Mobile first.
You've got to think about Mobile was the first capital of French Louisiana, and the French were very strategic when they created a colony because it was from the crown down, and that they looked for certain things. They had the best of engineers and cartographers to map it. They were very strategic, and your center of population and culture moved where the capital was. And when the capital was moved ultimately to New Orleans, folks shifted over there, but he would have encountered the same frustrating situation that plagued the colonies, particularly the rural areas, for years. Oftentimes, you wouldn't have a cleric to do a wedding. A wedding would happen years after the union was made, and it's often the same with the culinary and the cultural scene. I mean, he followed where he knew he would have patronage and access to things brought in until they could grow the proper grains and so forth and start doing what they needed to do. But, I mean, a fascinating fellow deserving of more research.
I think so, too, because it's pretty, obvious, I think, that you could probably trace back and say that he definitely had the first oyster loaf or the first shrimp po' boy. I think all those
slap
are probably,
on something.
There's no doubt he did that at some point. I know now, Steve
Make
Joynt.
that cornbread taste good.
When we had Steve Joynt on the podcast, we kind of talked about who did it first with Mobile and New Orleans, and he kind of took the approach of who cares really? Like, if you said you did it first, who cares? But I think there's something something to brag about with that, though.
I think it is very much historians love first, and we can claim so many things, being that we were settled earlier. But I think it's important to keep in mind, be it Mardi Gras, food, or anything, of what is our modern day, present day concept of the culinary scene or of Mardi Gras, and then that adds equal nuance, and it can spread the love around of how did we get where we are now with a given subject and how everyone's contributed. And Mardi Gras and food definitely offer a lot in terms of how you can understand them and appreciate them a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good point. Following the French and Indian War, that put Mobile into British hands. So the French no longer here. What do you think were there any British contributions to our food scene?
The British had great intentions. What they wanted to do here was to do something like they had done in the southernmost of the 13 colonies, particularly Virginia and South Carolina, of establish a plantation system, and the area was ripe for it. I mean, Mobile is at the mouth of the second largest navigable river system, and they wanted to create that which happened in the antebellum period of these series of plantations that went into a huge port. The French had that same vision, the British wanted to do it, and they had the commercial structure of the British Empire. Unfortunately, their timing was awful because there was a little tea party in Boston, and they weren't able to implement their intentions there. But you have the introduction of certain things that are synonymous with the British, of tea and of other aspects. I mean, with the French, you had cattle brought in, and that was huge. The Bellingraf property, Bellingraf Gardens and Home, that is atop the site. Their parking lot is where the home of one of the French governors was, and he had several hundred cattle, pigs, and so forth. So you have the British expanding upon that model of animals and things brought in, finer goods like tea, and broadening that trade network, because the British were all about trade. And you had an expansion of what was brought in. And it's interesting with the transition in power next to the Spanish that there was a civil exchange between the outgoing British official and the incoming Spanish, and the British gave wine, some tea, and the Spanish gave them some Havana cigars. So, I mean, it's something, again, each group in Mobile, be it a colonial occupying power or a wave of ethnicity once you get into the American period, really does shape the dining pattern. But the British had great intentions. They weren't realized in the British time period.
Yeah, and just like I said, bad timing, right?
Yeah, bad timing.
I'm really interested about that exchange that you mentioned between the British governor, outgoing British governor, and the incoming Spanish. Now they had.
It had been like the Last Supper.
I just was it an exchange before, like here's some Cuban cigars. Now I'm fixing to blast you away, or
the dice had already been cast, so to speak. I mean, the battle was lost in that regard. So it was just a civil exchange, official transfer on the site, regardless of the treaty. That one was going out, the other was going in, and just an offering, just the expression of civility and graciousness between gentlemen, so to speak.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. Well, how do you think these three European powers, the French, British, Spanish, how do you think overall they would have impacted our food scene?
I think the most telling form of their impact comes later. I mean, the colonial period, Mobile never reached the level of, say, a Philadelphia, a Charleston in the South, or like the great Spanish cities of South and Central America. We never reached that high degree of civilization that they did in terms of the architecture and food. But Mobile historians, even in the antebellum era, would look back to this time period and mythologize it. And I think particularly in the 20th century, we've looked back and aggrandized that and used it to help our dining scene from pretty much the 1850s to today. We love to speak of it and we like to think about it. So I think it was very much ex post facto. In reality, it was adaptation, and it provided a further building on the bounties of our area, be it from the soil or just various waterways. They provided a template which we had built from, and during the American era, which is so fascinating and so delicious, and thank goodness still ongoing, it's phenomenal how we have taken and run with it, always remaining very much distinctive, but taking into account situations only unique to us, but also things that translate countrywide. So it's again going back to that expression of Mobile as a gumbo. We still have very much our own receipt, and it's always based on that foundation in its fundamentals, but also how we love to tinker with that recipe and make it better than it was during that time period. It would not have been pleasant to have been a colonial resident of Mobile.
Right. So Mobile 1813, when it became an American city, and then followed right behind it 1819 is when the state of Alabama was formed. It's not the antebellum nostalgia that we think of during that time.
It was a rough and tumble time period, and there are many journal accounts of the early American period, and it was a young man's town. There was one traveler who described it as men with an absence of manners, if you will. I mean, multi-course meals being dispatched in a 10-minute time period. And it was, again, a young man's town. This was a town where it was the old Southwest, is what Alabama and Mississippi were called before they became states in 1817 and 1819. And people came here to make money. And they quickly made it through various booms and bust cycles. And by the 1830s, Mobile is beginning to develop the sophistication where it would ultimately be known as the Paris of the South, and that was definitely in place 1860, where our cotton-based economy had made us the, quote, cotton city, where men worked in cotton, married cotton, had cotton children, yada, yada, yada. It was based on cotton, but it calls for incredible wealth, and with that wealth came how you can spend it. I've heard two definitions of a millionaire. You can leave it behind or you can spend it. And a lot of people love spending it. And this is when Mobile truly became a metropolitan area in a larger sense of that river system is what made us. And you not only had Mobilians, but you had the families that owned the cotton plantations that would come to this city in the winter season. And it's you can't stress the importance of cotton. It's of what it did to the city. Arriving in town between September and November, people getting their monies from it. Where else could they spend it more easily than Mobile? And the city offered ways to do it, and it was a fascinating time period for the city, and that's when our first culinary golden age happened.
Yeah. And I guess I hadn't really thought about this till now, but you mentioned kind of that harvest season.
Yes.
It kind of leads right up into Mardi Gras.
It does lead up into Mardi Gras, and Mardi Gras is when you have some of the earliest accounts of our dining scene. Some of the earliest menus date back to that time period, and it was over the top. There's a 19th century menu that has over 50 items, 9 courses, and it's delicious what's described on that of haunch of black bear. You see the signs on 43, beware of bear, and they're there, and or robins on toast points. I mean, the various types of oysters, and by the 19th century there was such pride they would be labeled on menus where they came from, and it is so much more than Murder Point now. I mean, it was just phenomenal. I was speaking with a friend the other day, and he was talking about his family had a boat that would go down off the Yucatan to get snappers, and they were doing that back then, and it was that antebellum, that first golden age. I mean, you had restaurants that began to dive into ethnicities. You had Garibaldi's that had Italian-inspired food. You had the Restaurant Français that had French food. I mean, the sumptuous decor of these places on streets that are very much present in our dining scene right now, but it was so much of it was clustered a couple blocks off the river. And you had foods coming from near and far, but as you got to that point, right around Royal Street, that's where things really uptaked in terms of what you could buy to put on yourself, put in your home, and put in your belly, so to speak.
Also on Royal Street, you had where the History Museum is. It was the old City Hall building, Southern Market. And so maybe kind of describe a little bit, can you paint the picture of what that building would have looked like 1800s when it was the market?
The City Hall Southern Market is one of Mobile's 3 National Historic Landmarks, and those are very sparingly given out. Some states have but one, and Mobile has 3. You got the Battleship, Government Straight Prize, and quite deservedly so, the old City Hall Southern Market, the History Museum. And it's for 2 reasons. Its architecture is a good example of Italianate architecture, but also for its presence at the city council meetings, one of the longest places that city council meetings have had. You had government offices up above, and you had largely open space below, and then these multiple courtyards within and out, the interior ground floor spaces that sold foodstuffs, and the courtyards. It was an Aladdin's cave of a culinary experience. You had spices and things from all over the world. Produce, I mean, just phenomenal from the soils of Mobile and Baldwin counties, and it was anything you could want. I mean, you see things like in movies of these open markets. So you go to Charleston, and you have their market of the Café du Monde. Picture Mobile's, that majestic, huge building. I mean, it's a landmark. Imagine that, bustling with food. I mean, flowers, things which you could put on your table. The fish, the meats, bacon. I mean, things brought in from Cuba, things brought in from the water and the land of Central and South America, and again, the things brought in from the Orient. It was amazing, and that was the municipal market. That's not more like the other stores on the street. It was a phenomenal experience for people, and that it existed into the 20th century. I mean, some of the renderings from the 1920s and 30s show vestiges of that culture when it was on the decline. Accounts mention about the wonders that you could get. It was something very special, and if one could time travel, I'm a historian, I love to talk and write about the past. It puts literally bread on the table, so to speak, but I might not want to live back that. I would love to time travel just to walk through that market.
That's
and
right.
Then come back to air conditioning.
Yes. Right. Well, so if you that's a beautiful picture that you painted, and we're looking at the building right here, right where we're at. And if you notice the archways, right? So those were the courtyard. Is that correct?
Those archways opened into the big ones that you look through. You can see the multiple courtyards, and you got to think the portion that faces Water Street today, that's a little bit later. That blocks a couple of more sets of courtyards. So you had interior and exterior spaces, which you had temporary and permanent stalls. Think of it, Pepper Place of the antebellum era in Mobile, if you will, and into the 19th century, into the 20th century. So a good deal of the ground floor footprint within and without of that great building was foodstuffs.
Yeah, that's really cool. And and it is interesting too that building is a massive building. You don't really think about it. Kind of the way it's laid out now, it looks a little, it looks like a couple of buildings combined together, but it takes up an entire city block.
It does, and it's amazing what it offers our city to this day. And Meg McCrummon-Fowler and her team do a great job, and they celebrate the food experience there in multiple displays.
They do, yep. I know they have the yearly festival of the Colonial Eats, and I know that's a really cool thing they do also. Kind of moving ahead, we won't go too much into the Civil War era. I think we'll do an entire podcast probably on the Civil War one day. But maybe what were if you were a woman during the time of the Civil War, or if you were a man who didn't go off to war and you were still here in Mobile, kind of maybe what was some of the food like during that time?
For some people, the experience did not change. Mobile was the last great southern city to fall, and if you had means, you could get it. You wanted some chocolate, you wanted some cigars, you wanted coffee, you could get it. But for most, and in many patriotic people, it was not a good experience. You had bread riots, and I mean, Mobile became a convalescent hospital, if you will. I mean, there was an extreme shortage of foodstuffs in this town for particular items, and people relied on what they could grow in their vegetable gardens and things, and so much. It was a rough time.
Yeah.
And Reconstruction that followed was an equally interesting time period as the antebellum, and I think very defining in terms of our culinary scene as well. But getting to that point was rough.
Yeah. I guess you started to see more restaurants that kind of that are similar to today's restaurant scene. Started to open up in those late 1800s.
You do. I mean, Mobile's, we liken it to New York on a smaller scale in a way. You have, being a port town, both a river port town and a Gulf Coast town, you had waves of immigration that reflected national immigration patterns. You had, before the Civil War, you had an influx of people from Ireland and from various parts of the Mediterranean. After the Civil War, it increases in terms of our ethnic diversity. I mean, you have restaurants opening like the Koblenzer, which was run by an Irishman, but it was bohemian attuned. You have Mr. Klotsky, the first great restaurant man of Mobile, who was an Austrian gentleman. I mean, you have the Festorazzi family that arrived before the Civil War, but they established a very chic restaurant, and it was said Mr. Festorazzi trained in Milan and Marseille and came here, and he realized in a lifetime, sometimes what it took a family a couple of times, came here, lived above his restaurant, ultimately resided in a government street mansion that existed up until the 1960s. So you have these waves of people coming in and bringing their own designing traditions, but also adopting the bounties of what they had. Klotsky's was famous. I mean, for its time period of the 1880s going into the 1920s, it was a famous institution. I mean, the counts of their oysters done on little braziers right next to your table, the green turtle soup. I mean, so many mystic societies had some of their meetings and some of their dinners there. Or they had catering done. I mean, catering was established during the antebellum era, but I mean, it took a new level after the 19th century. And it should be noted, Mobile has always had a tradition of graciousness and hospitality. The cooks that staff the great houses of Government Street and Conception Street and Lower Church Street and the great villas of Midtown like Oakley, Ashland House, and the States of Spring Hill. I mean, they had owned them chickens, turkeys, ducks, and that great food traditions continued. They just continued to diversify in the 19th century to reflect continued ethnic trends, and it would grow even more in the 20th century after we had no longer immigrants coming into our port. It's fascinating how it worked.
I'm interested by what you said about, some of the immigrants. I guess when they arrived here or arrived in the United States, probably through places like Chicago or New York, they probably had no idea that, of course, they were maybe interested in the restaurant business, maybe working in restaurants. Like, Jason Malbus, worked in a restaurant before he started, but I guess that, they probably had no idea that, oyster soups and turtle soups and things like that were about to be on the menu.
It's infinitely practical, build on what you have, but give it a different spin. And I mean, it's the waves of immigration have greatly contributed to our culinary renaissance that we're experiencing today. And the Reconstruction period in the latter half of the 19th century, they're all have in some ways been neglected to what cultural flowerings you had. Even in the rough times, you can find commonality and commiserate over a good meal. And that culinary boom, Mobile is food scene, it didn't slack. And as you get into the 20th century, you get into, let's say in the 1880s, 1890s, through the first few decades of the 20th century, Mobile's second golden age happens. And it's very much like today, if you will, Chris. We had a glorious past to look back to. And this is when they start really aggrandizing that colonial stuff. But they also had a very exciting future to anticipate. And that's when this mentality, that Janus looking forward, looking backward, hit on another economic boom time. I mean, this was when Mobile, the banana docks, when more bananas were arriving in our port than any other through United Fruit. And you have restaurants of great renown that had already been established, like Klotsky's, but new ones coming in. And so much of what Mobile takes pride in, now Government Street reached its height. Great suburbs were built, such as Ashland Place, the streetcar lines, the city was growing. It really did boom. That our food scene exploded in those first 4 decades. And I mean, into the Depression, this city was hit hard. We were an agricultural port town, and it's just our food scene was always on point. I think of it with the banana docks, with Eugene Walter saying his love of monkeys came from like a bowl of bananas and a monkey popped out. I mean, it was another big time in our culinary scene.
I think you're right, and I'm reminded too those first few years, especially around Royal and Dolphin. You had
it was a hot spot.
What do you think that? I guess you had the newly rebuilt Battle House. You had the Van Antwerp building, the skyscraper that was a architectural marvel at that time, and then places like Morrison's and Constantine's, the Metropolitan. And you had a lot of like the most popular places right there at Royal and Dolphin. What kind of made that area so unique and popular?
Multiple reasons. One, practicality. We are a poor town, and if you experience Mobile walking around or running, or just you can even feel it in your vehicle, it steps up a little bit. That is some of the older land that's been there. That's not infill. You got to also take into natural topography and precedent of just being a city of then 200 some odd years. You also have density, and I think that's something we don't realize. Mobile was once so much more dense. Buildings went right up close to the river. I mean, it was an urban town. We still are a big town, one of the biggest cities in the Gulf Coast region. It was built up. I mean, you didn't have these vacant lots. And when you have a 13-floor wonder like the Van Antwerp building built, I mean, that's even more density. And you have other lost high-rise buildings like the First National Bank, a huge hotel. It wasn't just the Battle House, it was the Cawthon, the Bienville, and you had multiple people living here. Families was bigger, so it was a greater density. And I think that's one contribution. I mean, I love thinking of the Van Antwerp building just because it is one of our great landmarks, the first skyscraper, so the first of its building type, the first of a particular type of skyscraper, the Chicago one with its brilliant cornice that's been so beautifully restored by the RSA. A local wit who lived well into his 80s, 90s was a Mr. Palmer Pillins, and he left behind a wonderful memoirs that were published by, in limited edition, by his grandson, the late Palmer Hamilton. And the grandfather, Mr. Pillins, wrote that the Van Antwerp building was a one-stop shop. You go see a doctor and get a bad prognosis. You go get some medicine, get a bite to eat, then get your hair cut, and after signing your will, and go home. And you had just within that. So there are multiple reasons why that site. If you got density, you got higher ground, you have places where locals and an increasing number of business people from all over the world could have easing. We were a walkable city then and now, so I think that's why. And still a hub of our dining scene today.
I think that you hit on that density. That's an interesting point. I was thinking in some of my readings I've read where a lot of people lived in hotels at that time as well.
It was
so
very much a
not like you
trend.
think now where you think of just, well, if you're visiting here, you stay in a hotel. I think maybe in those days a lot of people lived in the hotels.
People did. It was a particular thing for widows in particular, or that it definitely hit a certain segment of our population. I mean, and it was across the world. And definitely in this country, it was not uncommon.
Yeah. 1900s also brought us several of our iconic restaurants. I mean, some of the ones that we enjoy today, right? Wenzel's and the Dewdrop, Callahan's. How would you summarize the 1900s? If you can.
The early 20th century through the 1940s, it did give us some of our staples. I mean, the Dewdrop, the oldest restaurant in the city, could possibly date to the 1880s, but its known beginnings date from the 1920s, and I believe it's on its third, maybe its fourth site on Old Shell Road there, and it's been there for as long as anyone's been alive to the present day. But I mean, it's an institution. I mean, they're known for the hot dogs, but they've got so much more to it. Wenzel's, I mean, that dates from one couple's trip up to New York and going to Grand Central Terminal. And guess what? Wenzel's Oyster Bar is still there, while sadly the Grand Central Terminal is not. Morrison's another lost one by name, but in the 1920s, and franchising out, again, restaurants becoming a business in a broader sense. I mean, going public, if you will, having, an entity. I mean, and that's also patronage. I mean, Morrison's was funded by the Outlaw family, who continue to be wonderful and gracious cultural stewards to this day. So you definitely have institutions that are still lingering that trace their roots back then. I mean, in that time period, you also have some signature dishes coming into being, like Bailey's West Indies salad coming into being, and that's such an essential Mobile dish with the oils, very different from the Maison with the mayonnaise and the capers and the mustard. I mean, it's just that time period was just very exciting.
Yeah. And what about Mardi Gras during that time? I know, well, and I guess you back up to some of the late 1800s. You had some of the more popular Mardi Gras organizations start to come about around that time. What were some of the food, maybe at some of those early balls or banquets?
Carnival weaves its way into every phase of Mobile's history, and you first got to define what it is. American Carnival is a parade done by an organization, what we call mystic societies here, what our New Orleans friends call crews. A parade by a crew, by a mystic society, or according to a theme that everybody can enjoy. The Broadway shows for everybody to see on the streets, followed by an invitation-only ball for members and guests. You have your time of sparkle, but you also have the work and the nitty-gritty of it, grinding your teeth of keeping an organization going throughout the year. So you have meetings, and particularly once September hits and people come in, because let's face it, Mobile is hotter than the hinges of hell in a heat wave, and after this winter I am so glad of our humidity. But things kind of quiet down for the summer, but during the carnival season, food takes multiple forms. For members of mystic societies, for people who are not members of mystic societies, people who come to town, non-Mobilians, to enjoy it. And food takes all forms. And some of those old menus, I referenced one of them earlier, where you had over 50 menu items. I mean, it would have been served buffet style with waiters. And this was a time where you didn't have mystic societies owning dens. I mean, mystic societies, you have your structure, you've got a president, vice president, secretary, particularly with the men's organization. You got to get a guy in and bump him up the officer system where he knows all sides of it, and it's taught. And you have these dens, they weren't permanent. They would go from place to place as needed, and they would have a meal catered, say, by Klotsky's or go to Klotsky's, and this is for the old line organizations. But it wasn't just the fancy stuff. I mean, the Mystic Stripers was established in a meeting at Tommy's Diner. I mean, it was just, that's how they established the nuts and bolts of who was going to do what and so forth. And it goes across our city, and it's places like restaurants. It's now where the dens that are permanently owned. It is the food, like in the various rooms, like for the crew of Columbus, and I know that members of that organization have their great attachment to their rooms and what they the civic society, the caterers do there, what they bring in themselves. And I mean, it's a fascinating experience. And then you throw in the two organizations that do public coronations, Mobile Carnival Association and the Mobile Area Mardi Gras Association. They each have their traditions, and all of them have their culinary components to it. I mean, it can be, as the exhibit said, chicken on a stick that has 40-year-old grease that makes it taste delicious, or some delicious thing conjured up by Sarah Clark with Bay Gourmet The Crown, or the amazing Clifton William Morzette with Morzette and Company. I mean, their tune on wonton that's served at a Mystic Society function on the Sunday before Mardi Gras. It's amazing. I mean, there is something for every culinary interest, and it's phenomenal. Mardi Gras' various tie-in with foods, and let's face it, you can catch it free from the street. I mean, like a moon pie. I mean, one family that owned China doll rice, the guys of that family have thrown China doll rice. I mean, I've been told by several people they'd call it Kaneka sausage. I mean, it's just, that's a good thing. How long is it cold? Is it solid? Throw that on the grill.
That's what I think I'm most fascinated about with Carnival and food is the fact that you think about some of the balls and you think about some of the elegant dining, but then you also even whether it's the complete opposite end of the spectrum, somebody bringing their own food, sitting there
tailgating
on the tailgate, in the food trucks, and
I think we've all experienced going to a parade night with family or friends and getting home and then coming home throwing out a casserole or something like that, and the moon pies are all in the back of the vehicle the next day. I mean, it's something, and that it arrives during a time period where things are cooler, and you can enjoy being outside, grilling out. I mean, it's something very special, and it's something that I lament to folks that are visiting during the carnival season, and I tell them, you need to come back and see us, because so many of our restaurants restrict the number of menu items so they can accommodate the vast crowd.
That's a good
point. You
point.
need to come and see us in other times during the year where you get the full-fledged of our restaurants and can enjoy it a little more. I mean, there are so many ways which you can explore food, and in that exhibit we looked at it from throws through the formal meals like the Queen's Luncheon, the King's Supper, Mystic Society meetings, and it's just there's so many aspects of carnival tradition, and everybody has their own traditions. They're the larger collective traditions of the community, but food touches everybody. It's a common denominator,
and that's why we got you on today for sure. What in all of your research, what do you think? What was the most fascinating thing that you discovered with that?
For researching carnival and cuisine, which was two-part, it was once a culinary history with a lot of text on the wall, and probably our chairman of the board and you were the only three people who read it through, and then the various aspects of it that looked like food that you call it throws or Mystic Society meetings. Throughout both parts of it, I think the thing that I took away most was the obvious that we have such a rich culinary tradition here, and how it is very much unique, but how we tie into other cities too. I mean, it's the local aspect that makes Mobile so special, be it culinary or otherwise, but how we also relate to other southern towns, other national cities, and other port towns. I think that it was just our connectivity to ourselves and beyond it, I think, was the most fascinating thing.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I want to transition to our next segment of the show, and that's called Meat and Three. So we've gotten into the meat of the podcast already. Okay. So I've got three questions for you, three burning questions that all the listeners want to know about carnival. So
haven't helped.
Now, I've seen you out to eat several times at some downtown restaurants, but so what are some of your favorite, what are your go-to places when it comes to restaurants in Mobile?
I am a foodie. I do love good food, and I've got a diverse taste in food. One of my favorite places will always be Noble South, and I was here when it opened, and I think it did so much for our dining scene. I like a good meat and three type thing, but I like that they offer sandwiches and that they took and added some spin to southern, good staple Gulf Coast things like pickled shrimp, and they have deviled eggs with bacon on it. And I mean, I'm kind of like an old lady reincarnate. I like the salads, like the pimento cheese, the chicken salad that you can put between some good bread. So that's definitely a go-to. I lived in Oakley for many years, and to be able to go to Callahan's was just so special.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the atmosphere with those windows that slide up, those wraparound galleries. It's a Mobile treasure. One very special place that I love to go to downtown, and I don't go there as often as I'd like, is Noja. I mean, it's everything. It's a limited menu, but the setting, the food. I mean, the chocolate ice cream with a little bit of guilt popped in.
Absolutely.
One that I truly enjoyed the experience the most is the bluegill. I mean, being able to be in America's Amazon, our river delta. I mean, and the flaming oysters, a good po' boy. Those are my favorites.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
My favorites.
I like that. My second question is, so you, like I said, you studied in Charleston and grew up in Selma. You've been a world traveler, right? So what's a great dining experience that you've had outside of Mobile?
Outside of Mobile, one of the most special for me, the first time I went abroad I was 18 years old, and I went with my aunt and uncle to France, and both of them are French speakers, and it was a magical experience. And the last part of that great trip was in Paris, and we went to a restaurant called Bowfingers, which is kind of like the Chez Fonfon side of Highlands. This is that of the famous restaurant Maxime's. It's owned by the Rothschild family, and I mean, I wasn't a legal drinking age in the United States, but it was some amazing wine and just good food, and that was like, for me, the first experience. I mean, my parents had done like most parents do, of take their kids to nicer restaurants to learn manners, how you conduct yourself. But that was the first time at age 18 it sunk. And I'll forever be delighted by that experience with my aunt and uncle at Bowfingers.
Yeah, that's good. My last question is it might be a little tricky for you, but if somebody really wanted to explore Mobile's food history at a restaurant, like where do you think they would start? Where would you send them?
I'll tell you, I would send them to Felix's. I mean, their menu alone, and this is a credit to Mr. David Cooper, it's a reference to so many of Mobile's restaurants. I mean, the names Piniotu and Constantine's are mentioned. I mean, it's some ways a history lesson reading, or an atmospheric history lesson reading the menu. And you get a good taste of Mobile, both in town, what's it like being across the bay, just the descriptions and menu items, plus to be able to look across the water. I think that provides a good glimpse into it, and that's a good foundation which to taste, because you get different aspects of the Mobile seafood meat experience, and just looking through the menu and definitely putting a fork or a spoon in your mouth.
Yeah, I think you nailed that. Mm-hmm. I agree with you. Like I said, the Piniotu. Mm-hmm. You taste some of the Greek dishes that we've been eating in Mobile for over 100 years, right? And when you go to Felix, some of those.
I mean, just like the appetizer, that's the three soups and a little demitasse type cup serving, where you've got a crab suit, a gumbo, and a turtle soup.
Yeah, where else can you get a turtle soup?
Mic drop.
Yeah, that's right. That's good stuff. Our next segment of the show is called Chris's Dishes. That's where I talk about the best dish that I've had over the last week, and I'll share with you. And if you've got a dish that you'd like to share as well, I'll turn that over to you. But the best dish that I had was from the Rennie's Honey Butter food truck, and so she has her location. She was on our podcast episode a few weeks ago, a few podcast episodes back, which was a really good episode to go check out. But she's got her location out there in West Mobile at Cottage Hill and McFarland. But she also has a food truck that she takes around town on Tuesdays and throughout the middle of the week. And so she came downtown a couple of weeks ago, and I had the Memphis potato. So she has a potato. She puts some of her Rennie's honey butter barbecue on this potato. So it's her barbecue honey butter, which is really unique. I think that's pretty fascinating. But she also has pork from Meatballs, and so it was so you had delicious pork, of course, barbecue sauce, cheese, all this on a potato. Fantastic. Really, really good stuff. And she's doing a really good job, Meredith is, with the food truck. So, well, how about you? Have you had a good dish that you could contribute to us?
Well, I want to find that food truck. I'll tell you, we went to Grace the other evening and got the Mother Clucker, and I love their menu because, like, the 7 signature appetizers are the 7 deadly sins, so a little humor there. But the Mother Clucker is like a spicy Nashville hot chicken breast, delicious. I mean, juicy, you bite into it, the crunch and everything with the pickles. It's kind of like a Wickles pickle and a good sauce on it. So, I mean, it's a messy thing to eat, but I mean, the shirt had to be thrown out afterward just because I'm a messy eater, but it was so worth it.
I'm a messy eater.
Yeah. Also. I tell the people I apologize. I preface it. It's like, this is going to be everywhere, but that's a sign that it was really good.
That's right. So how can they follow you right now? What do y'all have going on at the Carnival Museum? Tell people how they can come see you.
We always have something going on at the Carnival Museum. There are 14 galleries in the museum, and there's the belief that we don't change things out. We do. I mean, some galleries change out 4 times a year. We change out our coronation galleries for Carnival Association and MAMGA once a year. Our thematic series, which from Chicken on a Stick to Fancy Fair was a part of, we currently have up on exhibit of Carnival in Silver, which is not a once in a lifetime. There will never be something like this. It'll be followed in November through an exhibit that'll be up through the whole of Mardi Gras, called Mardi Gras Through the Eyes of a Child. And it's the experience of Mardi Gras as a little kid, I mean a baby, through a tween, if you will. And we're excited about that. So we're working on plans for installing it. In our Mystic Society series, we've opened up an exhibit on the Mystic Stripers Society. And in the coming months, we'll have an exhibit on the Maids of Mirth and the Order of Polka Dots. We're constantly updating things. We've got exhibits planned in the works on Carnival and invitations. Pretty in Pink, which will look at the Camellia Ball, so it'll look like the whole ballroom's been oozed with Pepto-Bismol. But that's going to be a really fun one, and we love bringing in guest curators for our shows, so we've got some fun ones lined up for those exhibits. So we're constantly changing something. Our hours are 9 to 4 on Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, and our approach is to tell the great story of our city through our greatest living tradition of Carnival. And we tell you about the colonial eras, the antebellum era, that turn of the century period, Mobile of the Waterman era, when we became the birthplace of container shipping, in our present day. And we do it through Mardi Gras, speaking of it as an art, an economic engine, a good time, and a family affair, and food and fashion. I mean, there's something for everybody, so we cater it to what people want in our exhibitings, and we guarantee tours at 9:30, 11 o'clock, and 1:30 in the afternoon. And we've got a good group of several docents that range in age from their 20s through well into their 80s, and they each bring a passion for not only Carnival with Mardi Gras at height, but this city. And so we look forward to seeing you soon, and we always love suggestions. I mean, Carnival in Silver, which is up, was a suggestion of one of our board members. A good friend's mother suggested the Camellia Ball exhibit. So come see us, give us your feedback. I mean, it's just an institution doesn't grow if it doesn't respond. And so we look forward to seeing you, welcoming us, and we are welcoming y'all soon.
Yeah, y'all do a great job, that's for sure. I know when I'm on the tour and people are asking me, where they should go, I always point them to the Carnival Museum for sure.
Carnival makes people happy.
Yeah, that's right. Even if you don't like museums, you'll love this museum. There's no doubt about it. So y'all do a great job. I appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you. Good being with you, Chris.
Yeah. I also had a story that I was going to tell you too. That I haven't told you this before, but if you ever get a chance to take a tour with Cart, one of the city tours, you should absolutely do it. I know that he was very influential for me becoming a tour guide. He probably doesn't know this, but there was a tour that you give. I think it was with the city when they were doing the April tours, the free tours. This was before we started Gumbo Bites, and I took my family down there, and you gave the tour, and it was fantastic. I think we did Church Street, maybe that area, and it was a fantastic time. And like I said, this was I had not even had starting a tour company was not even on my radar. It was just something that I wanted to do in my free time. But I was really inspired by your storytelling and your tour guide skills and your love and your passion for Mobile. That it was definitely a driver. Looking back now, it was definitely one of those steps in my journey to having Gumbo Bites and to becoming a tour guide too. So I like I said, I appreciate you and your passion for Mobile.
Warning for parents with children: I love little ones, but I have a potty mouth, so you might want to remind me that the little person is 7.
That's
not
a good
18.
point. I believe at that time I know we had the double stroller, so they were not interested in it. They were just, looking around at that point. But no, it was great. But again, thank you for all you do in the Carnival Museum. Thanks for coming on this podcast.
Have the pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
I've enjoyed it. I got another little thing I wanted to share with y'all before we get out of here. I've been trying to keep this on. I've been told I got to keep this on the down low, but I think now is probably the best time to share with y'all that we've won the Nappy Award for 2023, best local podcast. So super excited about that, and appreciate everybody voting for us in that category. And we'll party it up for you at the Singer Theater when they have the Nappy Award program. And so super excited to hang a banner up in here. That's what I'm really excited about for our future guests, to brag about. So I'm just real excited about the podcast, and it's been incredible hearing everybody's stories. Restaurant owners to historians like Cart, and just we've had people like Joycelyn Davis who's getting things going in Africatown, and just so many great people along the way, and I'm excited about to share these stories and to be on this journey with y'all. So thanks for listening to the Port City Plate Podcast, and we'll catch you on the next episode.